Welcome back. What great adverts they were. It is time to talk football, and we're going to be talking growth decree, as Adam said in the top of the show. So, what was the growth decree? Well, basically, this was like layman's terms. I'm not very good with tax and finance. It was basically the government would pay a large percentage of tax on high earners to encourage highly skilled workers to come into the country. There was a brain drain within Italy where a lot of people were leaving in order to earn more money, and it was something that kind of was left to counteract that, right? But with the new government, there's lots of things we can criticize them for. That's not for this podcast, but this government have decided that they are going to remove the growth decree. And Francesco, how did you first feel about this story when it came out? Do you think, if we look away from football, do you think it's a good thing for the country as a whole before we focus on football?
I think it's very difficult to give a blank judgment on this topic. Kind of opening the Pandora box regarding the whole economy of Italy and how the country is going. I personally don't think it's a smart move. Has difficulty in retaining talent, as you say, especially young people. So you're basically removing the one incentive that people had to come back. And so I don't think it's a really smart decision and thought through. So we'll see on the long term how it will impact the whole economy in Italy.
And it's come at a kind of bad, well, is there ever a good time? But it seems to have come at a bad time, Adam, because it feels like Serie A was really growing, right? Serie A, we've been talking about for a long time, second best league in Europe, basically, probably for the last 4 years, I would say. It's been the most competitive, the highest quality behind the Premier League. Of course, that will rattle some other Serie A podcasts that we know. But do you think this will... How do you think this will affect Serie A and the levels that it's able to achieve? Because we've really enjoyed the renaissance that we've seen with this.
Yeah, I would say Serie A has blossomed over the last few seasons. Obviously, it was helped by last year. You saw the amount of Italian clubs in Europe and what they were able to display, and even prior to that, you sort of were excited about the league, even as a neutral, like you would clock on and you would look at the results and you go, something's going on in Serie A. There's so many goals right now. Italy was kind of known for being very ultra defensive when I was growing up, for example, and it was always kind of very tough to see kind of 3-3 results. And now you were getting these really large results and even surprises, smaller teams, outdoing themselves and really being competitive in the league. So it actually opened up a huge kind of opportunity in terms of the brand aspect for Serie A. And I suppose, with this growth decree kind of ruling, it's going to put that under jeopardy now. And I suppose there's a lot of question marks still going on about, those that are currently signed up. Is that going to last till the end of this season, or is it going to be any further, or is it to the end of their contracts, for example? That needs to be kind of looked into. Chairman around Serie A clubs, they're really despairing at this decision. But there is kind of, I suppose, benefits as well that we have to talk about. So that sustainability aspect. You saw what La Liga did, for example, how they've tried to rebalance that power shift from the bigger clubs to the smaller clubs. And you've got a great example with Girona doing quite well. Could we see someone like Fiorentina now blossom, for example? The other aspects, I suppose, we've talked about it quite extensively, Rory, and you'll know quite well as well, is around Italian homegrown players. They've struggled. Obviously, there seems to be a promising sign with the under-17s, under-19s. They seem to be, there seems to be a strong team ethos, but it's how do we encourage those players that are Serie C level, for example, Serie B, for example, how can we make them better to then potentially step up? Because there's always been that kind of degree of clubs being promoted from Serie B, those players want to stay in Serie B because they get a better wage. So that seems a bit strange as well in itself. But there's so many kind of opportunities there, but then it's really outweighed by those impacts, I suppose, because you think about if that growth decree goes, those players then go elsewhere, and that means declining revenue for the league as well as the clubs. We know how badly run Serie A is in terms of its brands and promotion around the globe. I mean, you only have to look at the TV rights, for example, and the deal that they were able to achieve. Like, they should be doing more. And they've got a great product. Serie A is one of those leagues that people tune into. They really want to watch it, but it's undersold. So you've got some real big opportunities that, FIGC, for example, could be doing more, for example. And obviously, I think, Rory, it's going to encourage more backers of the Super League. And that's the big thing. And it'll be interesting to see what Francesco's thoughts is around that as well, because Agnelli was a big advocate around that. It was mixed reaction from what I could see about the Juventus base generally. But I think, we know about a certain podcast that's like adamant that the Super League has to happen for Italian clubs to grow. And this is just going to address that balance to be more in favour of that. So interesting topics here that we've got to talk about as well, because, it's quite heavily weighed, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting point. I'm going to go to Francesco. Like, how do you feel the clubs are going to deal with this? Because obviously Inter there's always rumours about them going bankrupt, right? Juve don't have a lot of money, which is why you're starting to lean more on the youth products, right? Milan don't have a lot of money. There's a lot of clubs here that are kind of living beyond their means. Do you expect us to see fairly immediate results from this growth decree growing out, or do you think they'll give the clubs time to adapt?
I think I've read that they're going to use the club until end of February to prepare for it.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, it's kind of the typical way of doing things in Italy, where they just drop it halfway through the season without giving any type of heads up or warning.
Yeah.
They tend to do that at government level with other types of directives that are not impacting football. So it's always quite interesting. But I think it will have repercussions. I mean, ultimately, you're removing one of the few tools the Italian Serie A had to compete with the Premier League. As you said, I do believe that the Serie A is the second best league. Premier League throughout coming and so when the rule of quite level. So now with this new decision by the government and removing this opportunity to make the Serie A grow even more, I don't know if these investors are gonna be so interested in putting money into the project. It's definitely probably not gonna attract a lot of new customers, new investors, and ultimately, I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see, because one of the main points in favor of this, as you said, Adam, was it will at least replenish the pool of young Italian talents. But I think that that's not a problem because you have, as a lot of backers says, you have too many strangers, too many foreigners playing in Serie A who are paid more than an Italian, but cost less on the papers because of the decreto crescita. I think that it's a systemic problem within the Lega Calcio in Italy, because the way the whole football structure and pyramid is built is not promoting growth within the other categories that are outside the Serie A. And the gap from Serie B to Serie A is still quite high. And now, as you were saying, Juventus with the under-23 team, they kind of played around that quite early. I think that was a very smart move from Agnelli and the whole board of Juventus. And they're paying now the fruit, because they have players who are more ready. Other teams which have Primavera still, which is the under 20 team, they struggle to bring them forward into the main. And that's one of the main issues that the whole Italian football and Italian league has. Bringing forward young
this is
very complicated.
Sorry, well, this is something I wanted to ask you about, because obviously Juventus have got Juventus Next Gen, who are currently playing in Serie A, right? And I think as of next season, Atalanta have a team that are joining, and Inter have a team that are joining. Do you think this is something that we're going to see widespread? And do you think this is a good thing? Because, for example, like Adam and me, we both follow lower league football teams, right? League Two, League One. I personally don't like the idea of Crew Alexandra playing Arsenal reserves, right? Or Manchester United reserves. I think we're not a reserve team. We should play first teams, right? But as someone who supports a team who has a team in the lower leagues, do you think this is a good thing for Italian football and could be something that kind of helps young Italian players and helps the league improve away from the growth decree?
I think definitely. I'm not sure all the teams do it. I don't think all the teams are interested in doing the same model. But teams that saw what Juventus did and were interested, they definitely work towards making it happen. I do understand what you're saying, your point of like if I'm a team from Serie A and I have to play against Juventus Next Gen, who cannot go down or cannot go up. Not really that interesting for them. But I think for the way the Italian football is and the hardship it is for young players to break through, definitely going to be beneficial. And if you look at it in Spain, they have beaten for quite some time. And Barcelona, one of the main reasons they bring through so much talent is because of the beating they have.
No, that's very true. And Germany has it as well. I think like there's quite a few leagues across Europe that do have it. So Adam, do you see this as a positive? Do you think this is something? Because I think ultimately, if you're thinking solely about Italian football and about Italian players, it is a positive, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's encouraged, right, that we kind of get to a sustainable point. But I would allude to the point of that revenue that is lost from these players that are going to be affected by the growth decree. How is the league going to be what it used to be in the 90s, for example? I mean, even then, I think this was the thing that I always took from one of the interviews. I think it was Paolo Maldini said, even though there was a limit in terms of the internationals, as an Italian, you had to make sure you were at that level as well to be part of the squad, right? You wanted to ensure that you were part of the squad. So I do feel that that kind of influence will be missed if, the growth decree is removed, and it feels like that's going to happen regardless. And, there doesn't seem to be kind of a plan B. There could have been something else thought about this kind of, maybe this taxation. What could have been done to encourage maybe the arts or the entertainment, as we would call it, for example? How can we make sure that we're getting that talent, still being part or paying into Italian society, for example, but still being part of what we want to grow ultimately? And I think it's, we've talked a lot about how Serie A doesn't really sell itself really well already, but this is a huge opportunity that I think they didn't anticipate to happen straight away. And, just as an example of the impacts, like Inter Milan's kind of wage bill is at 44.7 million with the decree, but now they'd have to pay 59.6 million. So this huge jump in terms of that revenue that they have to somehow, and this is not just Inter Milan. You think about Milan, Roma is going to be a good example, because Claudio Lotito has basically said, look, Roma are dead now because they had to pay for Jose, they had to pay for Lukaku, and now they're not going to have those.
That Dybala contract is going to be huge. Like, it's massive.
I'm surprised Juventus still haven't gone in there with a bid, but
getting back on the cheap.
I know there was the rumors. I'm surprised people in Europe haven't actually clocked on to these contracts as well. But I suspect it may be one that will, as January goes on, we might see some moves or
Well,
things
he
happen.
he has a release fee that is just for teams
Yes.
outside Italy, I think, right?
So from what I've read, it is for teams outside of Italy, but also there is the opportunity for the likes of Juventus to go in there, but it has to be agreed by Roma. So this is where they have to sweet talk Roma and say, you're short of some money. Let's pay you a little bit extra, maybe on the side, and then release Dybala to us. Well, it'll be interesting because Dybala had his issues with the old board, didn't he? Not necessarily the current board. We'll see. But back to the topic, I think this is going to be one of those that maybe Serie A regrets really right now if the growth decree does get pushed through now.
Yeah, it feels like a real shame because, as we said, there was a renaissance. There is a renaissance in Serie A, and people are really like, I know. Well, I always measure it like when I go home, my mates talk to me about Serie A. Now, for English people to talk about a foreign league never happens. We don't pay attention to foreign things. But for my friends to turn around and be like, oh, I tell you what, Fiorentina are decent or Roma are looking good. Like, it's genuinely generating interest outside the country. So it's a shame to see this. But Adam, you said you were looking for positives. Did you manage to find any other positives?
Not off the top of my head, but I mean, I suppose the big one is that sustainability piece, which is encouraging teams like your Empoli's, for example, etc., to grow. And it's interesting. We've seen the likes of Sassuolo, for example, use a model where they've brought in talents from Italy and maybe brought to a lesser degree, but they've basically coached them up and then sold them off as a profit. So I think that's the aspect that I think is going to be encouraged with the clubs, because for them to compete with the likes of Milan, etc., they need revenue, right? They need big revenues to come through the door. And I think that's where it's helped with the likes of Fratesi, Locatelli, for example, Scamacca. Those sales probably cemented their future going forward. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that kind of develops going forward, because you know, there's always one or two talents across those lower reaching teams. So, for example, Empoli have Tommaso Baldanzi, who you know, I'll be interested to see where his future is. For example, we saw Paresi, for example, leave Empoli for Fiorentina as well. That was another one. Empoli is another example of that kind of club. And we've looked at the success of Bologna this season. They're a good example where they bought in players, trained them up, and then they sell them on at a profit as well. So I think that's the element that you can kind of say growth decree will benefit. But the problem is when you've got clubs like Juventus, Inter, Milan, they've got bigger kind of crowds coming to watch their games. That's how they make the revenue, for example. Sponsorship is bigger for those clubs as well. So it's going to be harder.
Yeah. I think they also don't want to be feeder clubs. I feel like every European league now, and it's something that I think is a fair criticism, and Francesco, I'll go to you for this, but it's a lot of Serie A fans or La Liga fans saying we're sick of being a feeder league for the Premier League. Like, basically any players that get decent just get bought by the Premier League. And Francesco, is this something that concerns you? And do you think it would push more Italian fans towards the Super League idea if this was to happen?
That's a good question. The Super League is a whole new other topic which actually really listening to you guys talk about it. To me, the Super League is something that was a good idea, very poorly applied and presented, especially in the first currency that year where
first round.
Just all of a sudden from one day to another came around and say like, okay, we're going to leave the leagues and leave the UEFA and do our own thing. But the idea behind it was a good one. Was a good one because FIFA and UEFA have way too much power, and it was quite clear that they were using that power as a monopoly. I always think that if you call yourself the regulators, then you either make rules or make business. It becomes a bit tricky to understand where the limits are, and you're working if you're doing anything that's a bit more for your own benefit. I don't think in Italy people are going to be so much opposed to the league, mainly because we tend to like the Serie A, we tend to like the teams who are playing in it, and supporters of teams in Italy. They're very attached to their teams and of all the different derbies that are in Italy. There's a lot of rivalries between a lot of teams. If you think in Tuscany, there's a team in every city, and they play each other almost every weekend. Same with north of Italy, you have the derby with Inter, you have the derby with Torino, there's the one with like Milan. There's a lot of these big games where people are excited about it. They're always excited to play against big teams outside of Italy, but if the Super League happens and they end up playing with teams that maybe have not less appeal, but it becomes too much of a regularity, I don't know if the fans are going to be so excited about it in a certain way. So it's a very difficult topic to think about. I think the Decreto Crescita, the impact it will have on the Italian team is they might have more talent coach from them, as you were saying. I know that a lot of people think that we'll see their club or feeder teams for the Premier League because the Bournemouth can mean of Juventus. So of course, then they're going to be like a bit questioning to buy a player rather than Juventus is going to go for a bottom of the table team in the Premier League. But then again, I go back to what I said before. This addressed more the systemic problem of the Serie A and the whole pyramid of football in Italy. Because if we want to catch up, we need to change the way the whole structure is and the way we approach football. And I think that, as you said, Adam, before the football, the TV rights. I mean, now we had a deal that's not that great, but until with the previous deal, it was impossible to understand where you were supposed to watch the game. You had to have 3 different memberships, subscriptions to be able to watch all of the games if you wanted to. And the Champions League was even a different one. So, yeah. A bit, we'll see. I don't think the Super League is going to be something that is going to entice so much the Italian fans. Probably mainly also because it was pushed by Juventus, and if you're not a Juventus fan, everybody else hates Juventus. So I think just because of that, probably they won't really be supporting
That's
it.
a very fair point. If you want to get Italians to not do something, just tell them Juventus want to do it, and 90% of the country will go, "No, we're okay. We don't want to do it. We don't want to do it." That's a very fair point. Well, for me personally, it's good to hear that, like, you know, in Italy, and I can see it here as well when I talk to fans, that there isn't that much interest in the Super League. I just hope that the growth decree doesn't push people that direction, because I think it may well do. But we're going to keep up with this story as and when it develops, I suppose, and see how fucked Inter are, because it's going to be interesting to see how hard it hits them. But for now, we're going to take a very quick break. And when we come back, we're going to come and talk about some actual football on a football pitch that happened. Balls were kicked, goals were scored, some. We will see you on the other side.